So starting with Commissioner Griswold.
Okay. Informational hearing only. Appreciate the update. I'm just going to give you my thoughts. I know we have other proposals that are, pending and in progress right now. Some of the parameters, I went back and looked at the October 2010 meeting to refresh memory of what we had at that time. I appreciate that the projects being proposed by those in favor and against have addressed some of our issues. The only concern that I have, and why I would be reluctant to support the current proposal, is I'm still of the opinion that the bypass aesthetically creates an issue from that visual corridor from the other side of the canyon, and or as I said back in October 2010, when you fly into San Diego, for a lot of people, that's the first thing you see. You should look over to California Tower and to see that bypass road. I'd love to see an aerial or a vision of what that would look like from that level. I don't really think that's as desirable. So I have concerns, but like I say, I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail. I did mention to Chairman Golba that I was watching some kind of a special recently, and I kind of like the idea of what they're starting to do with different types of problems in society. One of them was, for example, a $10 million prize to get somebody into space. Now there's a $1 million prize apparently to get a car that has 100 miles per gallon. And you've got all these teams of very capable, passionate people who are all vying for this. And they're really not even doing it for the money. They're doing it because they really care. And they're coming up with some really great ideas. And I know that might upset a lot of people who are consultants and so forth, who get paid to study and study and study and study things. But having lived in San Diego my entire life, which is now over 50 years, if we'd offered a $5 million prize 20 years ago for San Diego Airport, we might actually have a solution rather than $50 million worth of studies and no solution. So I appreciate what Mr. Jacobs is doing in trying to help this process, but I almost think that there ought to be some kind of like a prize for the team that comes up with the best idea, and then let everybody go at it. So anyway, I don't know how helpful that is, but I just think from a thinking standpoint, we always have limited resources, and we need results more than just study after study after study, and that model seems to be working in other areas of our life.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Golba.
A couple questions, and then I'll sort of try and end with my thoughts. But first one was, I don't know if it was really stated very clearly, what is the intended use of the grass area on top of the new parking garage? I mean, it's shown in the renderings as basically mostly lawn. There were a couple ornamental garden areas, I guess, but I mean, I'm trying to figure out what exactly on a Sunday or a Saturday afternoon that lawn area is going to have on it, and what the use is, and best and worst case. You both can respond. It's okay.
Thank you. One of the most important uses for that space, other than daily recreation, kids kicking a ball or throwing a ball, et cetera, is the way that the proposal is configured with the roadway going around behind the garage frees that space up to be the center of events in the park. If you've been in the park for a run on a Saturday morning, for example, that intersection is generally closed, and the event booths are set up there, and often a start-finish line is there, and so on and so forth. Those events could be moved north onto that lawn space, so the tents and start-finish could be on the promenade, leaving the Palisades parking and the circulation through the park open instead of having to be closed so many weekends out of the year.
And do you envision it for stretching into things like weddings or anything like that? I mean, is it private use issues as well too? Or, I mean, I'm trying to get a feel or flavor for what the benefit of that rooftop garden is.
Sure, excuse me. I would be surprised if people did not hold weddings and family events on that space. With the pergolas and picnic areas that are there, the formal garden that's there, actually the intent is that half of that be a formal succulent garden and half be a butterfly garden. I think just like the Alcazar Garden, it's going to be a new venue that people can have probably largely personal and family events in.
Okay, and I guess it can go too far too. I have a hard time imagining birthday parties with jumpies blown up on top of that garage lid too, so there's hopefully some definition that'll come down the road that will keep it as positive uses, I guess, too. And while I've got you, another question was, in terms of the spaces in the garage, what's proposed as the parking count there, how does that relate to the current on-surface lot? What's the delta between what we have on-surface right now and what you're proposing for the garage in the three levels?
There'll be 785 spaces in the garage, and there are 367 spaces in that lot today.
So it's doubling, basically,
Yeah.
in approximate round
400
numbers.
something.
And then the tram itself, there was discussion about the sort of limits of the tram on a regular basis, and then sort of a special use where the tram would be allowed access onto the plaza. And what's the thought process for what triggers bringing even a tram or vehicle back? I understand the emergency use and, obviously trucks offloading
Sure.
equipment and support for the facilities, but what brings the tram back onto the plaza? Is that a busy weekend? Is that, December nights? What is it?
Yeah, we're not, right now, we've looked at the operation of the tram primarily in terms of the shortest possible operation of the tram, how would that be supported and support the use of the garage and the revenues from the garage, and that works very well. So I haven't participated in any further studies of the day-to-day management of the tram, but we are very concerned that we'd be able to see it extended. It's actually just a matter of once an operator is selected to run that tram, they'll negotiate with the Park and Recreation Department, I presume, to set up a management plan. And I don't know if Stacy or Gordon, you...
Is there, as a follow-up and an advancement of that question too, my initial concern of that is that, if you bring the tram back on for rare occasions or special events or stuff like that, that almost sort of signifies you've got a larger crowd there for that special event or something that is a higher demand. Suddenly, as a worst-case imagery, I'm imagining those obnoxious little trains that run through the shopping malls that are enclosed, and almost mow down people left and right. Again, the separation of the pedestrian and the tram almost gets us back to status quo where we are today. Is how do you define? How do you separate? Is it, some obnoxious little horn on top of the electric tram that's pushing people out of the way? And I would want that to be considered, and I didn't see a whole lot of definition or specificity in how you commingle these uses that arguably we're spending all this time to eliminate the commingling of them. And then right back in goes this tram that may be how many cars long, and little kids are running in front of it and all that kind of stuff. So I think that has to be given some thought. I would sure like to see some definition of that by the time that you're back, if it's June 7th, as to how that is, whether it happens or not, or some sort of definition, because it seems like if it's used for the busy events, it's going to be that much more of a problem. I mean, obviously, having been there on December nights, you can barely walk, let alone get a tram through there. So same thing with busy summer weekends. It'd be the same way. So I kind of want to know what triggers that use and how that goes, because that's kind of a key element to sort of 2 steps forward, 1 step back in my eyes, as far as, we're talking about cars, but the tram is a big car. So
It's a good issue. We'll bring a response back when we come back.
perfect.
If I could just add on that, and it also relates to the use of the park. For the tram itself and the limitations of the passive area, the wedding, the venues, how many special events, what type of capacity can you have? Those are going to be operational issues that we're going to work with the Balboa Park Committee to help us define as our sanction advisory committee for that. So those are the types of things that we will continue to work with if in fact this moves forward.
Okay, perfect. And even if it's just a matter of somehow there's special paving integrated into the plaza that says, whether it be color or whatever like that, so that people are just aware that, when there is a tram running, this is where they're going or something like that. So we don't avoid that. Next one probably goes to, I guess, staff. And since I see we have historic staff here, Kathy, maybe it goes to you. And I don't know if you were here or not, but there was conversation this morning, I believe Bruce Coons was the one who said it, who sort of made a blanket statement about if we approve this project, that we would immediately lose the National Register finding for Balboa Park. And I saw eyebrows raised when it was said, and it struck me as a fairly bold blanket statement as well, too. And I'm just curious if that's true, if it's been researched, and what the standing is as far as the possibility of this project, if you will, upsetting the apple cart as far as the National Register for that.
Sure, I'd be glad to address that. I was here this morning. I heard the testimony. There is a process for removing a designated property from the National Register, whether it's just on the National Register or also a National Historic Landmark District. The National Park Service oversees that. It's a fairly lengthy process. It's very significant action. It requires It's a very high threshold in order to do that, and findings have to be made. It requires a public noticed meeting, notice to the property owner, which is the City of San Diego. It's defined in the Code of Federal Regulations, and it states that, in part, grounds for removing properties from the National Register are as follows. One, the property has ceased to meet the criteria for listing in the National Register because the qualities which caused it to be originally listed have been lost or destroyed. Staff does not believe that this project, even though it doesn't meet the Secretary of Interior standards in all of its elements, would meet that threshold. That's a very high threshold. We also don't believe that any individual or organization would petition to have Balboa Park delisted from the National Register and put it in jeopardy by doing that.
Kind of self-defeating as a concept, yeah, I know, but thank you for the clarification.
sure.
I do appreciate that. And then I guess the rest of them are just kind of generic comments. There's some items in there that were touched on, I think, by both opponents and proponents. Some of the sustainability features, they seem to go from timid to John's was a little bit more aggressive. But again, Balboa Park being what it is, and the whole idea of this having started as an exhibition and all that, I mean, I would like to see it as more than an afterthought to power the bathrooms. I find that grotesquely disappointing. Whether there's a way to integrate it in, have a central feature, even if it becomes its own. You've got these little hubs all over the place. I would love to see one of them become a little sustainability hub, where maybe it's underneath all the panels that are there, but it's showing kids, an inverter spinning backwards, or how much kilowatts the power, the panels are generating at that point. Balboa Park has always been a strong key proponent of education, and that to me seems like to brag about powering the bathrooms is woefully inadequate in my eyes for what this project. It should be much more of a visionary type project. If you're going to use sustainability, use it in more than sort of a bathroom mode use, and run with it and create something that becomes a positive as well for the park. The bike access that John raised was something that I had grave concerns about in reading and looking at the photos already. Any weekend, I mean, there seems to be as many bikes as cars as people coming across that bridge entering into the park. You look at the 14-foot wide bridge, you look at, I like the slenderness of the new bridge from a design perspective, but it also conjures up, busy weekends of cars, dodging bikes that are traveling in and out of stop traffic, and just a safety issue there. I'm not sure I'm convinced yet on a 14-foot wide drive lane you've got that covered, because it is a slalom course now coming off of the bridge to get into the inner reaches of the park, and I think that really has to be addressed better for me by the 7th. And last but by no means least is the part I think I struggle the most. Commissioner Griswold already mentioned the view issue. I think it was a very well made point about we have yet to see anything from the air traffic approach, what this will look like as well too, which I think arguably is the most seen image of that bridge, because you really got to go out of your way to find another part of Balboa Park to see it on a regular basis, but every time somebody flies in, they see it. The drop-off area that you mentioned in your presentation, I don't think works. I don't think it even comes close to working. You're talking about coming across the bridge, making your right-hand turn, going around a bend, making a left-hand turn, and you've got 8 cars there. Now, on a busy weekend, I think you're probably looking at more like 80 cars. You know what's going to happen. It's inevitable. It's like when they started the cell phone lot at the airport, and they put in 20 spaces, and suddenly they found out they needed 120 a week later. Anybody coming to pick up, I assume, can use that lot. You're supposed to pick somebody up at 3 o'clock, and they're stuck at, some ice cream snow cone, thing with the kids. And you've got cars just sitting there in queue. All of a sudden, then there's somebody wanting to make a left-hand turn in there. All 8 spots are filled. All of a sudden, bingo, the traffic starts backing up on your little turn, back up to the Cabrillo Bridge. Now, of course, you can see the people getting out of the car because they don't want to wait in order to be dropped off. So now you've got pedestrians on this narrow bridge. And frankly, I can see that becoming a free-for-all very, very quickly. Safety concerns of that, I think, are off the chart, just as far as how that's managed. I don't know a solution. I haven't studied this long enough, but that struck me immediately as something that 8 cars in Balboa Park for a drop-off is just woefully inadequate. And just, it has all the makings of just a disaster. Having not read the environmental impact report yet, I don't know if that's addressed or touched on, but that's something that I think for June 7th or whenever we hear this thing, I've really got to be convinced that a busy weekend can handle that drop off, and we're just, is it going to be like curbside drop off at the airport where you've got, the militant cop out there blowing the whistle saying you've got 3 minutes to drop off or pick up and that's it? Because otherwise I can see people just using that as short-term parking. If I'm supposed to go pick up my wife and kids, I'm just going to say, well, I'll just go park there and wait for them to show up. And 8 cars goes pretty quickly. So I think that was, beyond the obvious visual impact concerns that everybody's going to share across the board. That was something that I saw that I just didn't think was resolved well enough at all. So, and there certainly are parts of it I like a lot. I mean, this is never going to be an easy solution. Let's face it, we study this longer than the airport and still come up with 37 different designs, and it sounds like tonight we get yet another design. So, but having said that, there's a lot I do like. The intentions are good. But there are a few things like that I do struggle with as far as getting me to the point where I could fully support the project. So, and thank you very much. It was a great presentation.
Okay, Commissioner Pearson.
Thank you. I appreciate that both in favor and opposition provided us with a packet, and I found your drawings very helpful. This is quite complex. We're all trying to improve the park and to find a solution that we can live with for the next 100 years, 200 years. So these decisions are very important, they're very weighty, and I do appreciate that people are coming with a solution. I really do appreciate that. And I will try and start at the big picture as my questions and then get down to detail. And maybe this is more for staff. Will we see, what I found most useful in both presentations was drawings of the 92 plan and then the proposal. Will we see something like that for the overall circulation, for the landscape plan, for the extent of the grading and views? Is that in the EIR? Or will this, I'm kind of looking for something more than the PowerPoint presentation, but what is the document at the end of the day that we approve, and what does that look like, and what will we expect to see in June?
I'd like to address that. Charlie Daniels, Park and Recreation Department. The documents you will get when this comes for an action item are actual amendments to the Balboa Park Master Plan, which will include strikeout and underlined text and revised graphics. You will be able to see the previous graphic, which will have a big X through it, and then the proposed graphic. You'll also have the same strikeout and underline document for the Central Mesa Precise Plan. And you will have actually site development permit plans, which, if you're more attuned to that type of graphic, are very detailed. You'll be able to tell exactly where retaining walls are, where grading occurs. You'll be able to count parking spaces and all of that. So there will be quite a bit of detailed information when this comes forward as an action item. Does that address your concerns?
That's exactly what I was looking for.
Thank you.
Because in terms of weighing these decisions, I want to see what within that 92 plan, granted it's 20 years old, but what within that plan is still relevant today that we should work off of, that has bearing on making a decision, a very thoughtful decision about what we would change. Plans do change and situations call for that, so I'm not saying otherwise, but I think it's really important to understand the thought process and what the extent of those changes are. And I guess I might jump around a bit, but my concerns also, as Commissioner Golba said, the Alcazar parking lot really concerns me with that circulation. I think the success of it will be 2-3 times that with the valet parking, with the drop-off. The traffic calming crosswalk, it could be just a big speed bump. I don't know if there's an opportunity to have that be maybe even a larger calming table. There's enhanced paving. I'm concerned that we're seeing a design that's shoehorning something in that's in a space that really isn't a safe space. So that would be really important to explain what else was looked at as an alternative, and if there's another design that I think would work better. I'll try not to repeat all the other comments. I too am concerned about the bike access and looking at the new scheme where bikes are then sharing the travel lane as opposed to having a dedicated bike lane. And I think with the number of bicyclists we see using the park now, we should be thinking in the future of how to better accommodate bikes and not put them in these shared lanes, which I don't think are very safe. I do appreciate the design of the new bridge being refined. I'm not sure I'm yet in favor of it, I'll be honest. I agree that the visual studies that we'll get in the EIR, and then if there's any others that address the approach, I think all of us, when we've looked at the view corridors, it's a stunning bridge from all sides. So I want to continue to have that be the landmark in San Diego that it so duly deserves. So I think more information about some visual simulations would be very helpful. For instance, there was a speaker, and maybe it was in the presentation, that had the yellow numbers and the red numbers. Those would be great because that was a plan drawing. If we could see those as their visual cues and what that looks like. Some of this may be operational, but I'll go there anyway. I have concern.
Service vehicle tram location on the promenade, the that's the Pan American promenade, correct? So some of that, it sounds like, will be handled by Park and Rec with operational issues, but the way in which the tram will work into connecting the parking garage up to the main plaza, and there's a drawing or two that shows service vehicle access. I wasn't sure if that was off-peak, if that's all the time, because again, it goes to a previous commissioner's point. Our whole idea is getting cars out of that area, and that would be tram and pedestrian. So the service vehicle, I had a question about where the loading and unloading and all that would be, because I think that could actually be a pinch point, and would like to see maybe how else the service could be handled. The other area that seems to be needing some additional graphics or some section drawings maybe, and it was brought up by several of the speakers, was when you come underneath that pedestrian connection from the new lawn area to the organ pavilion, how will that really work? I mean, how easy will it be if you're at the international houses to walk across that? It seems like there's a couple of circulations, maybe some diagrams that help explain. People are going to cross at grade, I think, in some locations, and not just on that overpass. So do we assume everyone goes up on that overpass? I don't think so. I think human nature is just to stay at grade near the international houses and continue along. And I'm looking at a diagram that doesn't show exactly how that would be a safe crossing for pedestrians. I like the idea of really activating these spaces. I feel that the movable tables and chairs are excellent ideas. The shade trees changing from the palm trees to the broad canopy trees, I think those really set an environment that allows for flexibility. The idea of having the water feature also be flat, so it can be used for multiple purposes. I think this is really, it is San Diego's gem, and should be able to be flexible enough to be used for all sorts of events. And I was really pleased to see the landscape palette take on a different character in those areas. There are places, I think, where view corridors could be maintained, but trees could be added. So it isn't stark, I think, as one speaker had talked about. And we really want to make sure that these are activated. A question I had is, will design guidelines come back? One of the compelling images was looking at, there was this little Moorish metal work. Will there be design guidelines that come back? Because I think one of the things that, the good and bad of using SketchUp is that the restroom facilities and the arcades look a little bleak, I'll be honest. And it might be the color palette selected in the renderings. But that idea of taking these images and taking snapshots of the architectural character and having that resonate and having it be authentic, to me, is going to be very important, so that even these kiosks and these restrooms and these trellises continue to contribute to that architectural character. Will we see that type of design guideline coming back in June? And is that part of this package that you showed in the PowerPoint?
No, it's technical drawings, not renderings. They are tantamount to what I call a 25% complete construction set.
So building the materials palette, the color palette, elevations,
Yes.
things like that.
Yeah.
But are they still in the same character of what we're seeing? Or?
Yeah, and unfortunately David Marshall couldn't be here today. He's on vacation, and those are his buildings, but they are designed to look exactly like the Pueblo buildings in the Palisades and the style of the international cottages. So each building is keyed in terms of materials, palette, color, details, the use of window, the use of lintel, etc., all off of those other buildings, but put together in ways that are not directly trying to mimic. What David likes to say is, he calls the squint test, that a person who's expert in historic preservation should be able to quickly see that that's an old building, this is a new building, but to the person who's not schooled in historic preservation, it should feel like it's all fitting together really well.
So it's really, that will be in our June packet, those detailed drawings. My apologies, I'm looking at my notes. In terms of the garage, so the idea is to have it be naturally ventilated and have it stepped to the east. There was another proposal that we saw from one of the speakers of putting the garage in the canyon. Was that an option that you studied? And can you describe a little bit about why this scheme that's proposed is more preferable?
Sure, we absolutely studied it. We studied, I don't know the exact number, at least 8 or 9 different locations for the garage. The primary reason that it's here is that this land where we're putting the garage is already is parking. All the circulation systems are already adapted to that, and we're not taking any parkland away. The Gold Gulch alternative, in fact, takes not just parkland, but environmentally sensitive lands away by filling up a canyon. And I will say we have not had a strong showing from environmental advocates through the almost 200 meetings that we've had on the project. But I trust that were we to present filling up a naturalized canyon, I think we would find those people coming to the meetings much more often very quickly.
I had another question over there. Will this also allow for expansion of the International Village and have more houses?
Yes, it does.
Are there other areas that it allows for future expansion beyond just international housing?
Expansion in terms of more buildings? I'm not aware of any other plans. As you may know, or it sounds like you might know, that there are plans for expanding the international houses, and Vicki is here if you'd like to hear from her today, but we've worked very closely with her on making sure that these plans and those plans fit together, and they do. In terms of any other building expansions, I haven't heard of any, but we're not doing anything in particular to provide for or stand in the way of other expansions. The kind of expansions we've thought about, for example, I mentioned earlier, the way we're routing the roads would allow the expansion of parkland into the Palisades, which we think is something that would be very desirable to people.
If I could on that, the plan that's moving forward on the international cottages is actually will be a plan amendment because based upon the precise plan, it is built out to the plan. But there is the potential of that moving through the Balboa Park Committee for a plan amendment to expand. And if that moves forward, there is space available, as Mr. Johnson said, with this plan.
I think that covers my questions. If I have anything else, I can find it in my notes. Thank you.
Okay. Commissioner Smiley.
I just have a couple of questions, things that haven't been covered. The first one is not a showstopper, but if there's any future litigation, it might loom largely in that. I believe it was you went through the objectives. I didn't see anything in the objectives that supported the covered parking structure. It might want to connect those dots. And as Kristen mentioned, and I think we'd all agree, this is a citywide issue and project, if not regional. And is there a reason, I guess, Stacy, this question might go to you, is there a reason CPC isn't reviewing the project? I think we had the same situation with NTC reuse.
There's no reason why CPC wouldn't be reviewing this, but with this project being in Balboa Park, even though it has citywide, similar to if we had a project in Mission Bay, it would go through the actual community planning group and the surrounding areas. So, to my knowledge, I don't believe a regional park project we've brought to CPC. I'd have to defer to the planning staff.
Yeah, that was kind of my question. Why not? Because NTC reuse just dealt with the planning group, the Peninsula Planning Group. It didn't go to CPC.
The council policy addresses a planning group reviewing land use plans that are in their community planning area or related to their community planning area. So the CPC would review things that would affect all community planning groups.
Yeah, and that's what I think Balboa Park, this project would do. It affects everybody in the city, and you get a broader perspective, a collective perspective of all the planning groups. You know, they have either the chair or a representative on CPC, and I just think it'd give you a different perspective, but I won't beat a dead horse on it. I just raised the issue. I wasn't clear on the intersection, and I guess I would ask first, were plans for the bypass road, did they look at a more obtuse angle as opposed to a 90-degree angle? I see problems with traffic flow, and I'm not sure if there's a crosswalk. Is there any signage there? And how do we separate pedestrian from vehicular traffic? And I think there'd be a lot of backup. We know there's backup now, and I don't know what the workaround would be.
I think it's fair to say we and the engineers, and Rob Fitch is here, Rob, if you want to contribute to the answer at all, have looked about every conceivable configuration of the bridge, the intersection, etc. Let's not forget that there's a hard 90-degree turn in the park already. It's in the center of the Plaza Panel. And so today, for example, the backups that are occurring in the core of the park, as you know, on certain times the entire bridge will back up. Often that's because of valet cars plugging up the portal towards the porting pavilion. People are waiting to get to the valet, and that tends to cause a backup. We have extremely detailed numbers of the number of people being picked up and dropped off throughout the core of the park that we've taken on several occasions. So we know exactly how many cars are arriving per hour, and we've actually put together a series of traffic simulations so we can show you the arrival and departure procedures and dwell times for vehicles dropping off. It's an extreme amount of detail that we've gone into. I just didn't want to bore you all with that amount of detail today. But just as an important point, today at 3 o'clock, the 3 o'clock hour on a Saturday, on that sidewalk that goes from the Mingay to the Prado restaurant, from the House of Hospitality to the House of Charm, the southerly east-west sidewalk, we count 900 pedestrians crossing 700 cars that are turning right today. So 900 people and 700. At the new intersection, we count the same 700 cars, but only about 150 people crossing. So we are cutting the interface between cars and pedestrians dramatically by moving the main vehicular flow away from the main pedestrian flow. So that, and I could go to each intersection. We have numbers on every single intersection. Our model shows that the backup, as you say, at that right turn is insignificant, and including during special events and loading and unloading the globe, et cetera, when those peak times are taking place. But if you like, we can bring those simulations. And Rob, am I misstating, or do you want to add anything?
No, you basically covered everything. I think next time in June we will bring some more of those metrics.
Okay. Thank you. And the last one, it's obvious, but I'll state for the record, from the comments this morning, where they were citing that there were code violations, or they didn't meet code, or this finding couldn't be met. I would like you to, the staff, either in the follow-up report or when we get together again, to have the answers to those things, because there were some assertions made that I'm not saying they were true or not, but I would be interested to the staff answer on that. And the final thing is for Commissioner Golba. I think you could rest assured there'd be weddings, since every time I go down to Balboa Park on weekends, there are wedding parties posing for pictures, unless there's a separation of church and state issue here, which it probably would be. That's all I have. Thank you.
Okay, Commissioner Hess. Thank you. I want to thank everyone who came today. A lot of people put a lot of effort in regarding design. That's something I'm great on. So it's good to see a lot of different ideas out there. It's always a challenge to go last. You think you don't have any more questions if I don't have to.
Excuse me, you're not going last.
Well, close to going last, because I understand the chair's prerogative. But unfortunately, I do have a few questions. I actually like Commissioner Griswold's comments being provocative about the airport. And maybe if you solve the airport, then you and Commissioner Golba won't have to worry about that view when you fly over, because you'll be landing somewhere else. So we can get to work on that one next. One of the things that strikes me about this, and it goes to a comment made earlier by one of the speakers about there may be more economical ways to do things, there may be more efficient ways to do things, there may be faster ways to do things. But we are coming up on the 100-year anniversary of Balboa Park, and I think we need to take a long-term view, at least I will be. And some of the things that I'll be looking at long-term is the movement that we're making in many of our public spaces, and that's actually to eliminate cars, to eliminate parking in those spaces over the long term. When I look at these plans, I look at, is there anything that's going to help that or hurt that over the long term? I know there have been discussions in the past, and we don't need to go into today, about eliminating parking in Balboa Park. And those are very difficult discussions, because it's hard to imagine that tomorrow. But certainly when I look at it 100 years, I could see a much different look and feel to Balboa Park. So I'll be looking at those types of things when I render a decision on this. So one of my observations is the experience I have personally when I walk on the East Prado, which I think is a very enjoyable place to walk. And I was talking with staff about, I think when I first came here in 1974, I drove my car on East Prado before they closed it. And I remember it wasn't quite the romantic experience that some people think it is to drive through Balboa Park. It just took an awful darn long time. And walking on it was so much more pleasurable. I would like to see something like that happen to the West Prado in the Plaza de California. So anytime we put cars on that area, I struggle with how it is for our experience. So to create a similar type experience in the west side of the Plaza de Panama that many of us experience on the east side, I think would be a huge benefit. Which leads to an observation about running the tram through there, and some concerns I have that maybe the tram should also follow the bypass if the bypass does come to being. I look forward to the facts about the number of trips and the number of people. I don't think we've run too many people over in the Plaza de Panama, and I don't think we've run over too many cyclists yet, but I would like to see the facts, and I look forward to those studies that show what do we have today and what do we have in the future before I judge the safety issue, because we have existing conditions there today that we are finding a way to manage, and I commend park staff for doing that in a very congested space. Gulch got raised as a parking option. Was that analyzed? I just want to ask the question. So we will see that in the documentation. Okay, that's good to hear. The other I have, there was a comment made by one of the users, and I know Balboa Park has many users, and I'm the gentleman here with the archery club, and that group is here today. And I know there are some uses there that maybe there are long-term plans to remove, others will stay. Stacy, maybe you want to comment to the longer-term plans for many uses in there, and over time, is it appropriate for them to stay, or are we going to find them new and better homes at some point?
Well, if you're talking about the archery, there are no plans, I'm looking to Charlie to verify this, to remove them via the master plan, correct?
The master plan and precise plan say to relocate the archery range at such time that a suitable facility can be identified. So that's kind of the trigger.
Kind of like the airport, okay.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to get the archers out of there, but I also believe there may be, sometimes we have to think outside the box, and there may be a place that's more convenient and better for them. It's not today, maybe not tomorrow, but certainly as we think long-term about the park and what's the highest and best use of this fantastic asset that we have. Another question I have, and it's always confusing to me about our tree palette. We have eucalyptus and palm trees, and I don't believe they're indigenous, yet we seem to be somewhat enamored with them or in love with them. And I actually do like the fact that we are getting shade trees rather than palm trees. But is there some requirement that we continue to have to plant palm trees or eucalyptus, or can we start to move to something that really is going to fit the next 100 years a little bit better from a standpoint of all the things we're looking at for sustainability? And some cities have banned palm trees, by the way, just for the record.
Hi, Steve. Vicky Strada, Strada Land Planning. Our role in the project is working on the Platinum Trail. And right now, the only place where we have palm trees are those little holes that are coming up out of the parking structure, where we were able to replace them with broader headed trees. As past chair of the Urban Forestry Board, that's also a big thing for me to encourage those kinds of trees. Now, the only place we're actually proposing eucalyptus is where the bypass bridges, where the existing eucalyptus are, because to make it look to the best extent possible that bypass bridge is, has been there, and to make the vegetation look like it has before. So those are the only two places. That's the only place where we have eucalyptus, and the only place where we have palms is that one row within the parking structure. No palms anywhere else. And we are trying to, there's a whole bunch of indigenous plants where we can use them. But as you know, it's pretty difficult. There aren't that many native trees that we can use in an urban setting.
Sure. Looking for whatever trees are more appropriate from a standpoint of shade. But in this particular case, in Balboa Park, where maybe in some districts the palms are be part of the historic fabric, that is not the case in Balboa.
Yeah. And actually in June, I trust that we will actually have a lot more images, and I'll be able to show you a little bit more what the landscape palette looks like.
Okay.
Okay.
That would be great. And the last thing I want to touch on, and this was brought up earlier by a speaker regarding whether we pay for parking or not, and I know this is an ongoing debate in our city. There is a cost to free parking, and we see that everywhere, and I do believe that there's a solution there someday for us to look at appropriate pay parking and maybe better deals for local residents where they may be buy an annual permit or something, but providing parking free everywhere, and we've had this debate, and I know Park and Rec's been in the middle of it at the beach. I am sorry, but I had to bring it up. I think someday we have to have that courageous conversation about where it's appropriate to pay for parking, what are the appropriate rates for visitors, for residents, to encourage more people to use transit and other modes of transportation. So those are my comments. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Okay, so a lot of the questions I had going in, most of the other commissioners picked up, so I think that's good. I do, just sort of picking off some of my notes here, I did want to ask a bit if, Mr. Johnson, if you could come to the microphone here. So there was some testimony about the access to Palm Canyon. I'm wondering if you could just sort of, and then down into the archery range, if you could kind of talk a little bit about how that will work in the future. I'm not sure I understood that.
Sure. There are, depending on what you want to refer to as a point of access, there are two formal points of access that will be there when we are complete. One is in the southwest corner of the Alcazar parking lot. If you're familiar with that side of the Alcazar lot, there's a gate today. Just slightly to the southeast of that gate, there will be that stair that we talked about. We're about 4 feet above grade right there, and we'll be stepping down into the canyon. So it will simply be a stair that steps down and lands on the top of the archery range. So there'll be equal access into the archery range in the future. The existing boardwalk that leaves the east end and goes down through those beautiful ficus trees and swings around, we will actually extend that over to connect to the central area of the international colleges at the House of Pacific Relations, so that you'll be able to come to continue that boardwalk and then come to the international colleges in that location. Now that also happens to be right next to the location of where what was called the Honeymoon Bridge. In the 1935 exposition, there was a rustic log bridge that spanned the canyon there, and the abutments and stairs leading down to those abutments are still there. And people do use those to access informal trails into the canyon today. We're not really changing any of those informal trails whatsoever, so I would say it's equivalent or better access to the canyon.
Okay. Another thing, you talked a little bit about, in the Plaza de Panama, this idea there's a change of use.
Yes.
So I'm not sure I completely understood the thinking there. I mean, if it were possible, I'm not saying it is, if it were possible to completely restore the Plaza de Panama to 1915, how would that not support the uses you think are going to happen in the 21st century?
Sure. The one that people talk about the most, and especially people from the institutions where that's their living room, they look at those drawings and say that it would simply be hot and uninhabited. It would not attract people to the space. So the change of use is to make it comfortable for daily use, for people to linger in the space, where in fact it was rows of black acacias which were very tightly pleached and planted close together with benches on the edge. So there was no place for gathering of any scale other than a major gathering. It was really a big ceremonial space. And people would wander around in there during the exposition, but nobody stayed in that space. So the change of use is to make it from an exhibition space into a space that's comfortable and active on a daily basis. And I need to ask Kathy if you're still here. Am I misstating that in any way? That the change of use is really from an exposition scale of activity to a daily scale of activity. Yeah, and the distinction there is there are standards under the Secretary of the Interior standards. You have different choices. You can restore, you can rehabilitate, and there's a third, which is. Would you? That would be great. Thank you.
I think that discussion of the change in use came up in talking about which Secretary of Interior standards or treatments are applied. And I have to just find here, sorry, I thought I had this highlighted. There are 4 treatments. There's preservation, rehabilitation, restoration, and reconstruction. Preservation is basically preserving the historic resource as it is. And restoration focuses on returning a resource to a particular period. Rehabilitation standards acknowledge the need to alter or add to a resource to meet continuing or new uses. So in this case, it would be a continuing use of the park and the change in, I guess, focus of the use for the pedestrian plaza, not a whole new, different use that wasn't contemplated. And to allow those while retaining the resource's historic character. The Park Service does encourage the use of preservation and restoration standards for landmarks, but it's not mandated, and rehabilitation standards are an acceptable treatment option. And the reason the rehabilitation standard was picked for this project is it focuses on preservation and restoration of historic features, which are included in the project, as well as introduction of new features which are compatible and yet differentiated as non-historic element. Now, the project doesn't meet all the standards. All elements of the project doesn't meet all the standards. And that analysis is pretty lengthy and it's in the EIR. So you'll see the thinking on that. But in terms of the change of use and the appropriate standard, rehabilitation standard is the appropriate standard to use. And it is allowed under the Park Service guidance.
Okay. All right. That helps answer my question. I appreciate that. Well, I think what this really gets to for me is that, well, first of all, I want to thank everyone who's actually came here and presented an idea. I mean, I think that's tremendous that somebody cares enough about this that they want to put something forward to suggest a better way to think about it and to kind of draw upon the collective wisdom of all of us, I think is always a good thing. And it's really clear to me right now that there is no perfect scheme. The choice here is going to be amongst the kinds of trade-offs that one gets to get to higher goals. And the higher goals clearly are getting the cars and parking out of the center part of the park, making a more usable piece of the park. Some of the goals that were articulated by the proponents of the project. and I think are shared probably by those who don't agree with this particular direction, but at least have other versions about how to fix some aspects of the park. It is clear in my mind that the way that Plaza de Panama especially works today is not doing us any favors, is not doing Balboa Park any favors, and really is not our best foot forward. We have this incredible, important resource that people both here and around the world, frankly, admire, respect, and draw inspiration from. And I think it's incumbent upon us in our time and place to do it the best we can, in terms of our contributions to it, in terms of our rehabilitation of it, whatever it is. And I guess I'm somewhat disappointed to know that there isn't a moment in history, whether it be the 1915 exposition or the one in the 1930s, or any of those that really represent that kind of seminal moment in the park's presentation of who it is or what it is. In fact, it's this sort of series of overlays over time that happened, some good, some not so good. And I think we really have to get to a kind of reasonable, artful balancing of all these pieces of history and our own contributions to the continuum of history ourselves. And that to me is a really critical component of all this. There are competing visions, there are competing users. There are all kinds of things that are going on. We have standards today that deal with things like accessibility standards that didn't exist in 1915 or 1933 or whenever. In fact, didn't even exist until the late 90s, or the early 90s, I'm sorry, when the ADA was brought into law nationwide. So there are whole kinds of things that really are going to affect and influence the outcome of this thing. So really getting to that best version of what it is. And I guarantee you that no one is going to be completely happy with all those moves. And I think we all have to accept that's going to be the thing moving forward. It's the thing that I have resigned myself to. And as speaking as the chair of the Planning Commission, I have tried studiously to avoid the conversations, the dialogue that has been in the press, has been in various kinds of things, to allow me to be a participant in a very fair way about how this goes down, what is the recommendation we ultimately make to the political leaders, because ultimately those series of choices about our values, about our decisions, about our involvement in these things, ultimately have to rest with the people we elect to those positions. And obviously that's where it will go. But I want to make sure that we do our very best to make as good a recommendation as we can and to give them tools to help make their decision. That'll be our job. So I will be looking very closely at that sort of thing. I find it very interesting that the environmental analysis, and I will definitely be reading that document very carefully, describes, again, the premise I just made, that there is no perfect scheme. There are unmitigable situations in everything. If we left it exactly as it is today, we have problems. So there is no version of this. It's which ones are we willing to swallow and accept? So that's the thing we all got to come to grips with. Or which ones are reasonable to override? Because that's what we're looking at right now. It's which things need to be overridden. And I will tell you that, in my opinion, getting cars and traffic out of the Plaza de Panama would be a high priority for me personally. Having said that, I am not a fan of that bridge. I really don't like it. I don't like it what it does to the Cabrillo Bridge. I don't like the way it wraps around those buildings. I don't like the way it looks. I don't like its relationship to all those things. I am completely sympathetic to those who are really fighting hard to get rid of that bridge. But I will say, though, in that kind of balancing act that we have to make about these things, is that a fair trade-off for other kinds of things? Is it fair, for instance, to shut all the traffic off at the 6th Avenue and then force everybody else to sort of deal with those traffic impacts? I don't know the answer to that. I'm sure the people who live on those sides, particularly on the Park West side, would have an opinion about that sort of thing. And ultimately, we have to kind of come to grips with whether those things are reasonable trade-offs. I understand exactly the passion about that piece of it. I do own the book that was referenced, Bertrand Goodhue book on the exposition. I was fortunate enough to find it in a used bookstore, completely unrecognized by anybody for the value that it was. And this is the one I found was actually one of the first printings. I got really, really lucky. I just about fell over when I saw it. And I will go back and look at that because I do want to kind of understand what the original intentions were for this thing. And I'm looking at this series of photos across time, And by the time you get to the 1930s exposition, the eucalyptus trees have grown up to such an extent that a lot of those parts of the building are fairly obscured. So is that the piece of history that we want to tie into? Is that the section of time that we want to say is acceptable? Is it okay to see a bridge kind of behind the trees? I don't know. These are tough questions, difficult decisions to be made. I can tell you I don't like that bridge, but I don't know whether it's a worthy trade-off. I really do not like schemes that bring cars into Plaza de Panama at all. Although I will say, Mr. Schumacher, your version of it was as good a version as I've seen yet. It was very well done and very well thought through, but it still brings cars right to the heart of the plaza. And I don't like the suggestion on other schemes that you can park all along there to get to that point. And I know for Mr. Zebarth, your effort, I appreciate your sense of it. I really like the idea that you could get a lot of cars in there and pull all the cars out of the area next to the aerospace in the Ford building. That would be an incredible asset to the park to be able to get that huge parking lot out. And that's not being dealt with in this present scheme. But I think they're quite right that if we did propose filling that canyon with parking, people would turn out who aren't presently here or who haven't been alerted to the fact that that might be an issue. So there are trade-offs. There's no perfect scheme in all this. So I think moving forward, what I would ask in terms of our ability to kind of make an intelligent hearing on the 7th and to make an intelligent recommendation to the City Council is to make sure that we have all the tools in front of us relative to being able to analyze these choices, one against the other. And I guess I would encourage others of you who don't agree with some aspects of the present plan, that I would urge you to articulate visions that, as you have done, and maybe refine your vision in a way, because ultimately you're going to have to take this to City Council, that you're going to need to articulate in a way that describes why the thing that you're putting forward, the choices you're making, are a worthy choice. I've heard things like economics, I've heard things about economic impacts, I've heard safety, I've heard all kinds of things, but I'm urging you to format your conversation in a way that the trade-offs you make or suggest that the City Council makes are better trade-offs than the trade-offs from the scheme that's being put forward. Because that's really what it boils down to. There is no perfect version of this, and we have to all accept that. And I'm surprised that Soho is willing to drive a car through Plaza de Panama. I got to tell you, that one really surprised me. So maybe a little more articulation from Soho about why that's an acceptable piece. For me, those are the tools I will need to help make an intelligent decision. I remain open-minded about this. I have not made a decision. I will continue to avoid hearing a conversation, reading about the conversation, and will work hard to be a fair arbiter of that. And of course, as you come forward, I'll work really hard to make sure that your vision, whatever it is heard, given a fair shake. So, if there are other comments? No? Okay, well, I want to thank you for coming today. I appreciate your involvement and your sense of responsibility to the City of San Diego. With that, I'm going to close the hearing, adjourn the hearing.